They called him Taza, the ghost of the Dragoon Mountains, a name whispered in fear around the campfires of settlers and the barracks of the U.S. cavalry. He was a Chiricahua phantom, a warrior whose heart was said to be carved from the same unforgiving rock as his canyon hideouts. He led raids with a chilling precision, taking livestock rifles and lives, but never women. It was his one unbreakable rule. A mark of cruelty, some said a strange code of honor to others. But on a blistering July afternoon in 1878, that rule and the man himself would be shattered. He was tracking the very soldiers who had destroyed his world when a sound carried on the wind, not of horses or gunfire, but of splashing water, and a woman's soft, unguarded humming. Everything was about to change. The Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1878, was a crucible, a blistering anvil, where the hammer of manifest destiny was attempting to pound the land and its people into a new shape. At the heart of this volatile effort stood Fort Grant, a bastion of American authority rising from the dusty plains. It was a place of ramrod-straight soldiers, the constant jingle of spurs, and the snapping of the stars and stripes in the dry, relentless wind. Within this rigid world lived Seraphina Monroe, the daughter of the fort's commanding officer, Colonel Augustus Monroe. At 19, she possessed a beauty as striking and out of place as a blooming rose in the desert. With hair the color of spun corn silk and eyes the shade of a summer sky, she was the jewel of Fort Grant. But the fort was also her cage. Her father, a man whose ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the territory he sought to tame, saw her as his finest diplomatic tool. She was polished, educated in the East, and betrothed to Captain Sterling Croft, a man whose chiseled features and decorated uniform barely concealed a chillingly similar ambition. Seraphina's days were a carefully orchestrated routine of civility and restraint. She poured tea for visiting dignitaries, stitched needlepoint with the other officers' wives, and smiled placidly as her father and fiancé discussed strategies for the Apache problem. They spoke of the Chiricahua as if they were vermin to be exterminated, a pestilence upon the land. They spoke often of the most notorious of them all, Taza. Taza, they said, was a devil. He was the reason patrols went out and never returned. He was the shadow that flickered at the edge of their dominion. Colonel Monroe spoke his name with a mix of professional hatred and a grudging respect for his effectiveness as a foe. Captain Croft spoke it with contempt, vowing to be the man who would finally bring in Taza's scalp. Seraphina listened, and a cold dread would pool in her stomach. She saw the maps on her father's wall crisscrossed with patrol routes and marked with sites of skirmishes. She knew that beyond the fort's walls there was a world of violence and blood she could scarcely comprehend. Yet a part of her, a wild and untamed part she kept fiercely hidden, yearned to see that world. She was suffocating in the starched collars and polite society of the fort. She craved a moment of pure, unobserved freedom. On a particularly oppressive afternoon, when the heat shimmered above the parade ground and the drone of conversation in the colonel's quarters became unbearable, she decided to take it. She knew of a secluded pool a few miles from the fort, fed by a cool spring and hidden by a grove of cottonwood trees. It was a foolish risk, a direct defiance of her father's strictest orders. But the thought of the cool water on her skin was a temptation she could no longer resist. Slipping out on the pretext of visiting the sutler's store, she saddled her mare a gentle bay named Willow, and rode out not towards the store, but towards the low rolling hills to the west, to the cour. With every hoofbeat that carried her further from the fort, a weight lifted from her shoulders. The air smelled of sage and dust, not of starch and cigar smoke. Here she was not Colonel Monroe's daughter or Captain Croft's fiancée. She was just Seraphina. She found the pool easily. It was a small oasis of green in an ocean of brown and ochre. Sunlight filtered through the cottonwood leaves, dappling the surface of the water. Tying Willow to a tree, she quickly shed her restrictive clothing layer by frustrating layer until she stood bare in the warm air. The world felt new. She stepped into the pool, the water a shocking, delicious cold against her heated skin. She sank beneath the surface, the silence of the water a balm to her soul, and came up gasping, laughing softly to herself. For the first time in what felt like years, she felt utterly and completely free. Miles away in the jagged teeth of the Dragoon Mountains, Taza watched the heat haze dance over the valley. He was not a ghost, but a man of flesh and blood, honed to a razor's edge by loss. His face was a mask of hard angles and sun-cured leather. His eyes black and deep, holding the memory of fire and smoke. 5 years ago, he had been a different man, a husband, a father. He had lived in a quiet canyon with his wife Narlin and their young son Chaitan. Then the blue-coated soldiers had come. They were not from Fort Grant, but a roaming patrol from the south drunk on whiskey and power. They had called it a pacification action. Taza called it a massacre. He had been away on a hunt. He returned to find his world turned to ash and silence. From that day forward, the man he had been was buried with his family. In his place rose Taza, the vengeful spirit. He gathered the scattered and broken remnants of other bands, families shattered by the relentless advance of the whites. He taught them to fight not with loud war cries, but with the silence of the hawk and the cunning of the coyote. He became a leader born of grief. His one strange rule, never taking women or children, was not born of mercy. It was born of a pain so profound he could not bear to inflict it upon another. To take a woman was to create a widower. To take a child was to create a grieving parent. He would deny his enemies the same agony that fueled him. He would only give them a quick, clean death. It was the only shred of his former self he allowed to remain. On this day, he and 3 of his warriors, including his most trusted man, Nashite, were not raiding. They were hunting, not deer or antelope, but soldiers. A supply wagon was due to leave Fort Grant and Taza, aimed to intercept it to claim the rifles and ammunition within. They moved with a silence that was second nature, their ponies' hooves making no more sound than falling leaves. As they neared the trail, a sound reached Taza's keen ears. It was faint, carried on an updraft of wind. Not the rumble of a wagon or the talk of men. It was singing. A soft melodic humming. He held up a hand, and his warriors froze, becoming as still as the rocks around them. Taza dismounted, handing his reins to Nachit. "Stay," he commanded in the Apache tongue, his voice a low rasp. He moved forward alone, a predator closing in on an unknown sound. He crept through the brush, his moccasins making no purchase on the dry earth. He followed the sound to the edge of the cottonwood grove. Parting a screen of leaves, he looked down, and his world tilted on its axis. In the sun-dappled pool below, a woman was bathing. A white woman. Her skin was pale as moonlight, a stark contrast to the dark water. Her hair, a shocking gold, was piled atop her head, with loose tendrils clinging to her wet neck. She was humming, her head tilted back, her eyes closed in an expression of pure bliss. She was the most vulnerable, most beautiful, and most forbidden thing he had ever seen. knew who she had to be. No settler's wife or daughter would be this foolish this far from a settlement. She had the bearing of the fort. He recognized the fine leather of the saddle on the bay mare tied nearby. This had to be the colonel's daughter. The daughter of the man who commanded the soldiers who patrolled these lands. The man who represented everything Taza had sworn to destroy. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt. His code was clear. His path was clear. He should kill her. A silent flick of his wrist, and the source of his enemy's pride would be extinguished. It would be a blow more devastating than any stolen rifles. But his hand froze. He saw not the colonel's daughter, but a woman alone and unguarded. He saw not a symbol of his enemy, but the curve of her throat, the droplets of water on her shoulders. In her expression of simple joy, he saw a ghost of his wife Narlin, laughing as she washed clothes in their stream long ago. The memory was a physical blow stealing his breath. Behind him, Nashite had crept forward, his curiosity overcoming his orders. He peered through the leaves, and a low grunt of understanding and bloodlust escaped him. "The colonel's daughter," he whispered. "A great prize, Taza. Or a quick message." Taza did not turn. His eyes remained fixed on the woman in the water. The humming had stopped. She opened her eyes, a sigh of contentment on her lips, and for a heart-stopping moment, her gaze swept across the trees, passing directly over his hiding place without seeing him. His mind was a maelstrom. Every instinct, every vow of vengeance screamed at him to act. To kill her. But the ghost of Narlin, the echo of a forgotten life, held him paralyzed. Serafina began to wade towards the edge of the pool. The moment was ending. He had to decide. Kill her and fulfill his vow, or... What there was no other option. Leaving her be was unthinkable. Letting her return to the fort to raise an alarm was suicide. As she reached for her clothes, Taza made a decision that was not born of logic or strategy, but from a place of deep, fractured confusion. He broke his own sacred rule. He stepped out from the trees. Serafina's scream was cut short as his hand clamped over her mouth. Her sky-blue eyes went wide with a terror so pure it felt like another knife in his gut. In those eyes he saw himself for what he had become, a monster from the shadows, the cruel Apache of the soldiers' tales. And in that same terrible moment, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. The world dissolved into a blur of panic for Serafina. One moment, she was basking in stolen freedom. The next, she was held fast by a force that felt as unyielding as the earth itself. The hand over her mouth was rough, smelling of leather horse and something wild and smoky. Her eyes were locked on the man before her. He was nothing like the caricatures from the fort's gossip. He was not a slavering savage. He was lean and hard, his skin the color of burnished copper, etched with the fine lines of sun and hardship. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band. But it was his eyes that held her captive even more than his grip. They were as black and deep as a starless night, and in them she saw a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to name. Rage, pain, and something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like conflict. This was Taza. She knew it with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. He made a short, guttural sound, and two more men appeared from the trees. They moved with the same unnerving silence. One of them, his face a mask of brutal scars, looked at her with open hatred, his hand resting on a long-bladed knife. Taza said something sharp in his own tongue, and the other man reluctantly stepped back. With shocking efficiency, they bundled her into her own chemise, a gesture of practicality that felt more humiliating than the nakedness itself. Taza pulled her towards her mare Willow, who was stamping her feet and whinnying in distress. He lifted her onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing, mounting behind her in a single fluid motion. His arm wrapped around her waist, a band of steel pinning her against his chest. The scarred warrior Nachit spoke again, his tone urgent and angry. He gestured towards her, then towards the fort. Taza's reply was a single sharp word that cut the air and silenced him. The small party spurred their ponies, and with Willow forced to keep pace, they plunged into the wilderness, leaving the tranquil pool and Serafina's old life behind. The journey was a nightmare of jarring movement and suffocating fear. The land she had thought beautiful from a distance was now a hostile enemy. Thorny branches clawed at her, and the rocks seemed to threaten to trip the horses at every step. Taza's body was a rigid wall behind her. She could feel the tension in him, the tightly coiled power. He did not speak to her, did not look at her. He simply held her, his focus entirely on the treacherous path ahead. Her mind raced. What would they do to her? The stories she'd heard were a litany of horrors. Torture, slavery, a fate worse than death. She thought of her father, his face purple with rage at her disobedience. She thought of Sterling, his cold fury. A part of her shamefully felt a flicker of grim satisfaction that she had finally truly disrupted their perfect ordered world. But that feeling was quickly drowned by overwhelming terror. They rode for hours, climbing higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner, cooler. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. Serafina's initial terror began to subside, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and a strange, dislocated sense of observation. She watched Taza. He seemed to be a part of the landscape, his eyes constantly scanning the rocks, the sky, the trail behind them. He moved with the horse, anticipating its every step. There was an absolute competence about him that was both terrifying and, in a strange way, reassuring. He was not a mindless brute. He was a master of his world. As dusk settled, they finally stopped in a hidden canyon, a narrow slit in the rock invisible from the valley below. A small spring trickled from the canyon wall, and a few stunted pines clung to the rock. The other two warriors immediately set about making a small, smokeless fire, their movements economical and practiced. Taza dismounted and finally pulled her from the horse. Her legs, stiff and weak, buckled beneath her. He caught her, his grip on her arm firm, but not brutal, and set her down by the rock wall. He stood over her for a moment, his shadow long in the firelight. His expression was unreadable. Then he turned away, without a word. Nachite approached his face, a thunderous scowl. He threw a piece of dried meat onto the ground in front of her. "Eat!" he snarled the English word, thick with his accent. It was a command, not an offer. Serafina stared at the jerky, her stomach churning. She couldn't eat. She couldn't think. She was a captive, the property of these men. Taza returned, holding a tin cup of water from the spring. He crouched in front of her, holding it out. She flinched away. His eyes met hers, and for the first time the mask seemed to crack. She saw not cruelty, but a flicker of frustration, impatience. He spoke, his voice low and raspy, the first words he had directed at her. "The water is safe. Drink." His English was clear, almost unaccented, a shock that jolted her more than anything else. She stared at him bewildered. Hesitantly, she took the cup. Her hands trembled so much that water sloshed over the side. His hand came out not to grab, but to steady hers, his fingers briefly brushing against her own. The touch was like a spark of lightning, a fleeting connection that felt utterly alien in this context of violence and fear. She drank the cool water, a blessing to her parched throat. When she was done, he took the cup back and rose, moving to the other side of the fire to sit with his men. They spoke in low, urgent tones, their Apache words a guttural music she didn't understand. But she understood the gestures. Nashite kept pointing at her, his voice rising in anger. The third warrior seemed to agree with him. Taza's responses were always short, clipped, and final. He was being challenged, and it was over her. She was the source of a deep conflict within his own band. She was not a prize. She was a problem, a disruption to his own world just as he was to hers. Later, as the stars emerged in the ink-black sky, a blanket was tossed her way. It was rough wool, but it was warm. Taza gestured for her to lie down. He then took his own blanket and laid it on the ground a few feet away, between her and the canyon entrance. He lay down with his rifle cradled in his arms, facing out into the darkness. He was her guard, her captor, but also her protector from the vast, dark wilderness, and perhaps from his own men. Serafina lay awake for a long time, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of the sleeping men. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but it was now mingled with a profound and unsettling curiosity. Why had he taken her? Why was he breaking his own infamous rule? He hadn't harmed her, had given her water, had even shown a flicker of something other than cold hatred. The man who lay sleeping a few feet away was a puzzle, a contradiction. He was the cruel Apache from the stories, yet he had shown her a strange, unspoken form of restraint. He was a killer, yet he was keeping her alive, even defending her presence to his own men. She looked at his silhouette against the dying embers of the fire. He was the architect of her terror, the man who had ripped her from her life. But as she lay there in the heart of his world, a strange and dangerous thought took root in her mind. Perhaps he was just as trapped as she was, trapped by a past he couldn't escape and a decision he couldn't undo. The Apache stronghold, or rancheria, was not a single place, but a fluid concept. A series of hidden camps shifted with the seasons and the movements of the soldiers. The one Taza led Serafina to was nestled deep in a labyrinth of red rock canyons, accessible only through a narrow, winding pass that could be defended by a handful of warriors against an army. Her arrival caused an immediate stir. Women stopped their work of grinding corn and treating hides to stare. Children who had been playing games in the dust fell silent and scurried behind their mothers. The men, the warriors, gathered their faces hard and questioning. They looked from Taza to Serafina, a mixture of surprise and suspicion in their eyes. She was a ghost among them, a pale omen of the white world that was their mortal enemy. Taza ignored them all. He led her to a small, isolated wickiup, a simple dome-shaped dwelling made of branches and hides at the edge of the settlement. He motioned for her to go inside. It was sparse, containing only a few woven mats and fur blankets. This, it seemed, was to be her new cage. The days that followed fell into a strange, monotonous rhythm. Taza would leave at dawn with the other warriors, and he would not return until dusk. He left her food, usually a portion of whatever the community was eating, roasted venison, corn cakes, wild vegetables. He left a water skin full. He never spoke to her. His black eyes would meet hers for a brief, inscrutable moment, and then he would be gone. Nashit, however, made his presence felt. He would often stalk past her wiki-up, his glare a physical force. He saw her not as a person, but as a symbol of Taza's weakness, a dangerous folly that threatened them all. He believed she should have been killed at the stream, and he made no secret of it. His open hostility was a constant, terrifying reminder of her precarious position. It was the women who began to soften the edges of her captivity. At first they were distant, their faces closed. But Serafina was not the arrogant, helpless white woman they expected. She was quiet, observant, and deeply lonely. One afternoon, an elderly woman named Isti sat near the entrance of her wiki-up, her gnarled fingers struggling to thread a sinew through a tough piece of leather. On an impulse, Serafina, whose needlepoint skills were the talk of Fort Grant, gestured to the awl and the leather. Isti watched her with shrewd, suspicious eyes. Serafina made a small motion of threading a needle. Understanding dawned on the old woman's face. After a long moment, she grunted and handed the items over. Serafina's fine motor skills, honed by years of tedious embroidery, made quick work of the task. She pierced the leather cleanly and threaded the sinew through, handing it back to Isti. The old woman examined the stitch, then looked at Serafina, a flicker of grudging respect in her eyes. She grunted again, a sound that was less hostile this time, and went back to her work. It was a small moment, but it was a crack in the wall of isolation. From then on, Isti would sometimes leave a small bowl of berry mash for her, or a piece of baked squash. It was a silent communication, a bridge of shared domesticity across a chasm of culture and language. Serafina began to see them not as a faceless enemy, but as people. She saw mothers caring for their children, artisans working with skill, and a community bound by hardship and love. It was a life far removed from the savage existence her father described. Meanwhile, back at Fort Grant, chaos reigned. The discovery of Serafina's abandoned horse and clothing by the stream had sent a shock wave through the post. Colonel Augustus Monroe was a man possessed. His fury was monumental, a force of nature that terrified his subordinates. But beneath the fury was a cold, calculating fear. The disappearance of his daughter was not just a personal tragedy. It was a political disaster. "He took her," Monroe snarled, slamming his fist on the map-covered table in his office. "Taza. It has his mark all over it. The cunning, the audacity, but not the method. He never takes women." Captain Sterling Croft stood rigidly before him, his handsome face a mask of controlled rage. "Sir, it changes nothing. It only makes our mission clearer. We must hunt him down and make an example of him. A public example." "Of course we will hunt him down, Captain." Monroe snapped his voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He gestured to another map, one that was kept locked in his desk. It wasn't a standard military map. It was a geological survey map marked with notations indicating silver deposits. But we must be strategic. This incident, as tragic as it is, provides us with the perfect justification. Croft's eyes gleamed with understanding. Their plan, a secret and deeply illegal enterprise, was now cloaked in the righteous cause of rescuing the colonel's daughter. For months, Monroe and Croft, along with a syndicate of wealthy East Coast investors, had been plotting to seize control of the mineral-rich land in the Dragoon Mountains land, protected by treaty as Apache territory. Their strategy was simple. Provoke the Apache into a conflict so severe that the government would be forced to revoke the treaty and clear the land, leaving it open for them to file their mining claims. Taza's raids had been useful, but this was a gift from the heavens. We can get the authorization to push into the inner canyons all the way to the Sierra Madre, Croft said, tracing a line on the map. We can claim we have intelligence pointing to his stronghold there. By the time we're done, the Chiricahua will be broken, and the land will be ours. And my daughter, Monroe asked the question, sounding more like an afterthought. We will find her, sir, Croft said smoothly. Her safe return will be our highest priority. But she will understand that sacrifices must be made for the sake of progress. The unspoken implication hung in the air. Her survival was secondary to the larger prize. Only one man in the room felt a knot of unease: Caleb Dusty Rhodes. The chief of scouts stood by the window, his weathered face creased with skepticism. He had spent 30 years in the territory, and he knew the Apache better than any man in the cavalry. Colonel, Dusty began, his voice a low drawl. Begging your pardon, sir, but this stinks worse than a dead coyote in the sun. Taza don't take captives, not women. It ain't his way. Something else is going on here. What are you suggesting, Rhodes? Monroe demanded, his eyes cold. I'm suggesting that riding in there with guns blazing is the surest way to get Miss Serafina killed, Dusty said bluntly. If he has her, and that's a big if, he's holding her for a reason, and a full-scale invasion ain't gonna be it. Let me take a tracker, a Pima I trust, and go see if we can open a parley. Find out what he wants. Parley, Croft scoffed. We don't parley with murdering savages, old man. We eradicate them. And that's why you'll lose, Dusty muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Colonel Monroe's gaze was like ice. Your counsel is noted, Mr. Rhodes, and dismissed. Captain Croft will lead a punitive expedition. You will guide them, as is your duty. You will find Taza's camp, and you will lead the captain to it. That is an order. Is that clear? Dusty looked from the colonel's ruthless ambition to the captain's greedy zeal. He saw the truth clearly. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a land grab wrapped in the flag and sanctified by a father's supposed grief. And Serafina Monroe was just a pawn in their deadly game. Clear as mud, Colonel, Dusty said, turning to leave the room. As he walked out into the oppressive heat of the parade ground, he knew he was being ordered to lead a girl to her grave. Life in the rancheria continued its rhythm, and Serafina became a silent fixture within it. Her fear had not vanished, but it had changed shape, evolving into a constant low-level anxiety, a feeling of living on a knife's edge. She learned to read the moods of the camp, the quiet tension when scouts brought news of soldiers, the brief moments of laughter when the children played the somber respect during evening rituals she did not understand. She learned words not through teaching, but through listening. Nde for people, Tu for water, Da'akodaya for thank you. A word she whispered to Iste when the old woman brought her a piece of warm bread. Isti had become her unlikely unspoken guardian. The elderly Apache woman seemed to have taken it upon herself to ensure the white captive was fed, and left mostly alone, her authority in the camp apparently significant enough that even the glowering Nahit kept his distance. Taza remained an enigma. He was a phantom who appeared at dusk and vanished at dawn. He never addressed her, yet she felt his eyes on her constantly. When she sat outside her wickiup, she would sometimes catch a flicker of movement from the corner of her eye and know he was there watching from the shadows of a nearby dwelling or the high rocks overlooking the camp. It was not a lecherous gaze. It was watchful, analytical, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he himself had created. The bridge between their two worlds was built not with words, but with a child's fever. A sickness swept through the camp, a respiratory ailment that brought a harsh barking cough and a dangerous fever. It struck the very young and the very old, the hardest. Serafina watched with a growing sense of helplessness as the camp's medicine man performed chants and offered sacred pollen his efforts, seeming to have little effect against the relentless progression of the illness. One of the sickest was a little boy named Kitoiste's great-grandson. His small body was racked with coughing fits, and his skin was terrifyingly hot to the touch. For 2 days, Isti sat with him, her face a mask of stoic grief as he grew weaker. Serafina knew this illness. She had seen it at the fort where the post-surgeon had called it croup. She remembered the surgeon, a kind elderly man named Dr. Abernathy, explaining the treatment to a worried mother. Steam, he had said, and a tea made from willow bark to bring down the fever. Watching Quito gasp for breath, a desperate courage bloomed in her chest. She had to do something. Walking over to where Isti sat, she knelt down. She pointed to the boy's chest, mimed the act of coughing, then made a gesture for a pot and fire. She pointed to the trickling stream, and then to the willow trees that grew along its banks. Isti looked at her. Her eyes narrowed in suspicion and desperation. The medicine man scowled at her interference. But Isti, seeing the life draining from her great-grandson, was willing to try anything. She gave a sharp nod. Working quickly, Serafina directed a few of the other women. They brought a pot of water to a boil over a fire. She stripped bark from the willow branches, crushing it between 2 stones, as she'd seen them crush corn. She added the bark to a separate container of hot water, creating a bitter-smelling tea. When the pot of water was producing a thick cloud of steam, she had them carry it into Iste's wickiup, turning the small space into a makeshift steam room. Then she gently coaxed a few sips of the willow bark tea into the boy. She sat with him for hours, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth. Taza returned at dusk to find a scene that made him stop dead in his tracks. The white woman, his captive, was not in her wickiup. She was in Isti's tending to the sick child, moving with a quiet confidence, while the most respected elder in his band watched her with an expression of profound intensity. He said nothing. He simply stood in the shadows and watched. He watched as slowly, miraculously, Quito's breathing began to ease. The harsh, rasping sound softened, and the tension in his small body seemed to lessen. By the time the moon was high, the boy had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep, his fever finally broken. Isti put a hand on Serafina's arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. She looked into her eyes and said a single word in the Apache tongue, a word Serafina didn't know, but understood completely. It was a word of thanks. When Serafina finally emerged from the wickiup, exhausted but relieved, she found Taza waiting for her. He was standing by the dying embers of the communal fire, alone. He gestured for her to sit. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was different now. It was not the hostile silence of their first days, but a heavy, contemplative one. Finally, he broke it. "You have healing knowledge," he said. It was not a question. "My mother was often ill." Serafina replied, her voice quiet. "The fort doctor taught me a few things." He nodded, absorbing this. "The willow tree. It is a sacred tree to my people. a tree of life. You knew its spirit. I only knew it helps with fevers. He looked at her, then a long, searching look that seemed to peel back the layers of pretense and fear. Why did you help him? The question was simple, but the answer was complex. Because he was sick, she said. Because I couldn't just watch him die. Taza's face, for a fleeting moment, betrayed a deep and ancient pain. My son died of a fever. He said, his voice a low whisper, raw with a grief that time had not healed. The soldiers brought it to our village. There was no one to help. The confession hung in the air between them, a stunningly intimate revelation. He had just handed her the key to his entire being, the source of his pain, the engine of his vengeance. He was not a monster. He was a grieving father. I'm sorry, she whispered the words, feeling utterly inadequate. He looked away towards the dark mountains that cradled them. You are the daughter of the man who commands the soldiers, he stated, the old bitterness creeping back into his voice. The man who would see all of my people dead. I am his daughter, she admitted, finding a new strength in her own voice. But I am not him. At the fort I was a prisoner, just as I am here. A different kind of cage, but a cage nonetheless. Taza turned back to her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of understanding, a recognition of a shared truth. Both of them were trapped by the worlds they had been born into. I did not intend to take you, he said almost to himself. I have never. My law is not to harm women. But I saw you, and I remembered. He did not need to say what he remembered. She had seen it in his eyes that first day at the stream, a ghost of a memory, a lost love. In that moment, she was not Seraphina Monroe, Colonel's daughter to him. She was an echo of a life that had been stolen from him. His decision to take her had not been an act of war, but an act of profound, agonizing weakness, an attempt to hold on to a ghost. The bridge was built. Fragile and perilous, it spanned the chasm of their two warring worlds. They were captor and captive enemies by birth. But in the quiet of the canyon, under the silent gaze of the stars, they were just a man and a woman, both scarred by the lives they were forced to lead. And they both knew, with a dawning and terrifying certainty, that the soldiers were coming. The change in the camp was palpable. The news brought by a scout was dire. A large column of cavalry, more than 100 strong, had left Fort Grant. They were not on a routine patrol. They were moving with purpose, led by a tracker who knew the mountains. They were moving towards the stronghold. Panic, a tightly controlled and disciplined panic, rippled through the rancheria. The women began to pack essentials with swift, practiced efficiency. The warriors checked their rifles, their expressions grim. This was the fight they had always known was coming. Nashit sought out Taza, his face alight with a grim, "I told you so," fury. "This is your doing," he snarled in Apache. "You brought this curse upon us. That white woman was a beacon, and you lit it yourself. We should have killed her at the stream. Killing her would not have stopped them." Taza replied, his voice calm and cold, though Seraphina could see the tension in the set of his jaw. "Their greed is what leads them here, not her. She is just their excuse." "Then use the excuse," Nashit urged. "Kill her now, send her head back to the colonel. Show them we are not weak. Show them the price of invading our homes." Taza's hand fell to the hilt of his knife. "She is under my protection," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You will not touch her." The confrontation was a spark in a powder keg. For a moment, Serafina thought Nashite would challenge him, that she would be the cause of a fatal rift among the people who held her life in their hands. But Taza's authority, though questioned, held. Nashit spat on the ground and stalked away, to ready his own warriors, his hatred for her, now absolute. Taza turned to Serafina. The brief flicker of connection they had shared was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of their situation. "You cannot stay here," he said, his tone flat and decisive. "When they attack, they will not be trying to rescue you. They will kill anyone they see. You will be caught in the crossfire." "My father," she started, but the words died in her throat. She remembered the cold ambition in her father's eyes, Sterling's possessive fury. Dusty Rhodes's warning. Taza was right. This wasn't a rescue. "Your father wants this land," Taza said, confirming her deepest fears. "He wants the yellow iron beneath it. You were the key he needed to open the door. Now that it is open, he no longer needs the key." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. She was disposable, a pawn to be sacrificed. Her life with her father, her betrothal to Sterling, it had all been a lie, a gilded cage built on a foundation of greed. Taza grabbed her arm. "There is a place, a cave system higher in the mountains. Isti will take you and the children there. You must go. Now." He was pushing her away, putting her with the non-combatants, saving her life. But a fierce, defiant spirit she never knew she possessed rose within her. "And you?" she asked. "What will you do?" "I will lead my warriors," he said. "We will meet them in the pass. We will buy the women and children time to escape." He was planning to fight, to die most likely. He and his small band of warriors against 100 trained soldiers with superior firepower. It was a suicide mission. "No," she said, surprising herself with her own forcefulness. "There has to be another way." A faint, bitter smile touched his lips. "In your world, perhaps. Not in mine." He pushed her towards Isti, who was already gathering the small children. The old woman grabbed Serafina's hand, her grip like iron, and began pulling her towards a steep, hidden path that led up the canyon wall. Serafina looked back one last time. Taza was watching her, his face an unreadable mask. Their eyes met across the chaotic camp, a final silent acknowledgement of the impossible chasm between them. Then he turned and strode towards the canyon pass, his rifle in hand, a leader walking toward his destiny. The attack came at dawn. Serafina huddled in a cold, dark cave with the terrified women and children heard it begin. It started not with a bugle call, but with the sharp crack of a scout's rifle, followed by a thunderous volley from the soldiers. The sound echoed through the canyons, a terrifying drumbeat of death. Down below, the battle for the pass was brutal and swift. Taza and his warriors used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, firing from hidden positions, making the narrow pass a deadly funnel. But they were hopelessly outnumbered. The soldiers, led by a relentless Captain Croft, pressed forward, their repeating rifles spitting a constant stream of lead. Dusty Rhodes was with them, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He was firing high, trying to avoid hitting anyone, his role reduced to that of a reluctant participant in a massacre. He saw the futility and the injustice of it. This wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. Croft was not trying to subdue the Apache, he was trying to annihilate them. "Spread out, flank them!" Croft yelled, his face flushed with bloodlust. "No prisoners, I want Taza's head." A stray bullet ricocheted off the rock near Dusty, and he saw one of Taza's warriors fall from a high ledge. He saw Nachit, fighting with the fury of a cornered lion, take down 2 soldiers before a volley cut him down. The Apache resistance, fierce as it was, began to crumble. Taza knew the pass was lost. His only goal now was to delay, to bleed the soldiers for every inch of ground, to give the others more time. He fell back with his few remaining warriors, retreating towards the now abandoned camp. As he ran, a searing pain exploded in his left shoulder. A soldier's bullet had found its mark. He stumbled, but kept moving, the warm blood soaking his shirt. The soldiers poured into the camp, whooping and firing at the empty wickiups, setting them ablaze. The scene was one of chaos and destruction. Croft strode into the center of the burning camp, his eyes scanning for any sign of Serafina, or more importantly, Taza. "Find them," he bellowed. "Search every crevice, high above in the cave." Serafina listened to the sounds of the slaughter, her body trembling uncontrollably. Isti held a stoic vigil, her face carved from stone, but Serafina could see the tears tracking paths through the dust on her ancient cheeks. Then a new sound reached them, soldiers climbing the very path they had taken. They had been discovered. Panic erupted in the cave. Isti pushed Serafina towards the back of the cave system. "Go," she urged in Apache, pointing into the darkness. "There is another way out. The mountain will protect you." Isti and the other women stood at the mouth of the cave, preparing to make a last, hopeless stand to protect their children. Serafina hesitated, torn. To run was to be a coward. To stay was to die. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the mouth of the cave. It was Taza, his face pale with pain, his left arm hanging useless at his side, his shirt dark with blood. The soldiers below had not seen him slip away. He ignored the other women, his eyes finding Serafina instantly. "Come," he commanded, his voice strained. "There is no time." He knew this cave system. He led her away from the main cavern into a narrow fissure that was nearly invisible in the gloom. The sounds of shouting, and then a single, final, terrible volley of rifle fire echoed from the cave mouth behind them. Isti and the others were gone. Taza leaned against the rock wall, the last of his strength failing him. He had saved her, but he had lost everything else. His people were scattered dead or dying. His home was a smoking ruin. His cause was lost. He looked at Serafina, the white woman, who had inadvertently brought about his end, the woman he had saved against all reason. "Go," he gasped, pushing a small leather pouch into her hands. "Follow this tunnel. It leads down the far side of the mountain. Far from here. Go back to your world." "I won't leave you," she cried, trying to hold him up. "You must," he insisted, his body slumping. "My fight is over." She looked from his pain-filled eyes to the pouch in her hand. Inside, she could feel small, hard objects. She didn't know what they were, but she knew they were his last desperate gift. As soldiers' voices echoed closer in the tunnels, she made a choice. She would not let his sacrifice or Isti's be in vain. "I will come back," she vowed, though she didn't know how. "I promise." She turned and fled into the darkness of the tunnel, leaving the cruel Apache, who had never taken a woman to face his fate alone in the heart of his shattered world. Serafina stumbled out of the mountain tunnel into a blinding new day, miles from the smoking ruins of the camp. She was no longer the colonel's delicate daughter. She was a survivor, gaunt and alone, clad in Apache leather. In her hand, she gripped the small pouch Taza had pressed upon her. Inside, she found not jewels, but a half-dozen nuggets of raw silver ore and a crudely drawn map, his final devastating message. This was the proof. This was the true reason for the massacre. A cold fury propelled her east. For 2 days, she walked living off the harsh knowledge her captivity had taught her. The wilderness she once feared had become her sanctuary. It was the world of men she now dreaded. When a cavalry patrol finally found her, they saw not a rescued lady, but a wild thing with eyes as hard as the landscape. Her name, when she spoke, it was a shock they could barely comprehend. Her return to Fort Grant was not a triumph, but the arrival of a ghost. She bypassed her father's theatrical relief and Captain Croft's possessive grasp, walking straight into the colonel's office and shutting the door. "Serafina, my dear girl, you're safe." "Colonel Monroe," began his voice, thick with false emotion. "Captain Croft is a hero. He led the charge himself to save you." She looked at him, her sky-blue eyes now the color of cold steel. "You lied," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "It was never about saving me." She emptied the pouch onto his desk. The silver ore and the hide map lay between them, an indictment more powerful than any accusation. The colonel's face went pale, the mask of the grieving father dissolving to reveal the naked greed beneath. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "From the man you tried to murder," she replied. "The man who saved my life while your soldiers were slaughtering women and children in a cave." Captain Croft burst into the room, his face a mask of indignation until he saw the ore. His expression hardened. "You were with him. You sympathize with those savages." "I saw them as people," she corrected him, her voice ringing with a strength he had never heard. "People you wanted to erase so you could steal their land. This was never a rescue. It was a raid, and you are nothing but bandits." The confrontation was broken by the arrival of Dusty Rhodes. The old scout's face was a road map of grief. He had seen the bodies in the cave. He looked at Serafina at the oar and at the guilty faces of the 2 officers. "She's right," Colonel Dusty said, his voice heavy. "What we did out there, it was a massacre. And I have a feeling the territorial governor would be mighty interested to hear a first-hand account, especially from the rescued daughter of the commanding officer, especially one with proof of motive." The trap was sprung. Serafina was not the weak pawn they could sacrifice. She was their accuser, armed with the truth. Faced with an investigation that meant certain ruin, their conspiracy of blood and greed crumbled. Colonel Monroe vanished into a drab administrative post back east, and Captain Croft resigned his commission in disgrace. Serafina never returned to her old life. She stayed in the territory using her newfound voice and her father's name to advocate for the people he had tried to destroy. She never saw Taza again. Some said he died of his wounds in the mountains, but Dusty told her of another rumor, one whispered by the Pima, of a lone Apache warrior, his arm in a sling, heading south into the Sierra Madre of Mexico, a ghost seeking out the last of his people. Serafina chose to believe that rumor. Their worlds had collided in violence and ended in tragedy. But in that crucible something was forged. He had broken his cruelest rule for her, and in doing so, rediscovered a sliver of his humanity. And she, the colonel's daughter, had found her own unbreakable strength in his world. Their paths would never cross again, but they were forever bound by a reckoning in the dust. The story of Serafina and Taza is a stark reminder that history is rarely as simple as the stories we're told. It's not a tale of heroes and villains, but of broken people trying to survive in a world that wants to crush them. A warrior's cruel code was shattered by an unexpected moment of beauty, and a sheltered young woman found her true, unshakable strength in the heart of her enemy's world. They were pawns in a greater game of greed and ambition, yet they managed to find a sliver of humanity in one another, forever changing the course of their lives. If their story of unexpected connection and harsh justice moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this tale with someone who appreciates stories that go beyond the surface. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the dramatic, untold stories of the Wild West. What do you think Taza's true fate was? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening. For Wool.